Okay, so we're going to talk about reporting category number 4. We are going to talk about solving quadratic equations. And just remember, when you are solving a quadratic equation, you are finding the solutions, the roots, the zeros. Those are other words that are talking about the x-intercept. And it's simply where is the parabola crossing the x-axis. That's what you have to find. So depending on what information is being given to you in the problem, there's several ways that you can solve a quadratic equation. The first is a table. So if they give you a table, you want to look at y, okay? You want to focus in on that y column. And the reason is because when you are looking for an x-intercept, remember, an x-intercept, what number do you always know in the ordered pair when you have an x-intercept? It doesn't matter where you're at on that x-axis, your y value is always 0. This number is going to change because it's going to move you along the x-axis. So I'm looking for zeros in the y column. There's a 0. There's my first root. There's another 0. There's my other 0. So my solutions, my roots, my zeros for this quadratic in this table are at -1 and 1. It is crossing the x-axis at -1 and 1. For a graph, it's really easy. All you have to do is look at the x-axis. Where is this parabola crossing the x-axis? It's crossing at -1 and 3. So those are my roots. Those are my zeros. Those are my solutions. -1 and 3. All right. You can use the square root method, but there are some certain requirements that you have to have. It can be used when there is no x term. That means your b coefficient is 0. So if you notice your b coefficient is 0, then you can use the square root, okay? So if you look here, this is in standard form. I know it is in standard form because it is equal to 0, okay? It could be equal to y, it could be equal to f of x. And I see 2x squared minus 98. So what I want to do is I want to get my a and my c coefficients separated. I want there to be an equal sign between my a and my c coefficient. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add 98 to both sides so that I can move my c coefficient. So now I'm going to end up with 2x squared equals 98. And now I have an equal sign between my a and c coefficient. And I really want this a coefficient to be a 1, okay? So it's really important if you're going to use the square root method that a has to be equal to 1. If it's not, I can create a 1 here by dividing this a coefficient by itself. So whatever a is, if you divide it by itself, that's always going to give you a 1 because 2 divided by 2, guess what, is 1. Okay, so now I have 1x squared equals, and then I need to divide 98 by 2. So I'm going to go ahead and do that on my calculator. 98 divided by 2. And that is 49. And because the a coefficient is now a 1, now I'm ready to take the square root. So I'm just going to cover up that 1 with the square root symbol. And I'm going to take the square root of both sides. And now I'm going to type in the square root of 49. Now, if you get a decimal answer for your square root, that means you need to birthday cake this number to simplify it because that's how they're going to do it in your answer choices, okay? If you get a whole number, you know that your number was a perfect square number, and we do. So remember, when you take the square root, that these cancel out. So the square root and the power of 2 cancel each other out, and you're just left with x equals, and the square root of 49 is 7, okay? But remember, when you take the square root of a number, you're supposed to get 2 answers. You're supposed to get a negative and a positive. So I really have 2 answers here. I have a -7 is one root and a +7 is the other root. So my parabola, my U-shaped graph, crosses the x-axis at -7 and at +7. Don't forget to put that plus negative sign when you take the square root. All right, looking at factoring. Set the equation equal to 0, factor. Set each linear factor equal to 0 and solve. Okay, so again, I know that this is standard form because it says equal to 0. It could be equal to y, it could be equal to f of x. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to find my GCF. So I've got to find the GCF first. So I'm going to get my calculator. I'm going to go ahead and clear this out. So remember, to find the GCF, you hit math, you right arrow, and then you hit 9. And you want to type in your coefficients. Well, my A coefficient is a 1, comma, and my B coefficient is 11. And you can only type in 2 at a time. And now I'm going to get the coefficient of those two numbers. I'm going to use this GCF answer, and then I'm going to GCF it with the constant. And remember, if any of your coefficients are negative, you always have to put the positive answer. So I'm going to do this again because I did not put parentheses. I'm sorry, a comma between them. It's important to do that. And my GCF is a 1. You have to check, because if your GCF is something other than 1, what you have to do is now you have to divide all your coefficients by that GCF number. Well, if I divide 1, 11, and 18 by 1, they're not going to change. But I still needed to check for my GCF. So now I'm going to go to my X games. And remember, the top number, you multiply A and C together, 18. And the bottom is going to be 11. It's your B coefficient. And now you want to come up with two numbers that when you multiply them, you get 18. But when you add them, you get 11. So now I'm just going to kind of go to my calculator. And I'm thinking of 9 and 2. Because 9 times 2 is 18. And if I add 9 and 2, I get 11, so I know that they both have to be positive. You may have to play with the signs of your numbers to get the right combination to add to the bottom number of your X puzzle and to multiply to the top number of your X puzzle. So now I'm ready to move to the box. So remember, I'm going to take my first term, X squared, it goes in the top right box. My constant, the 18, goes in the bottom right box. And now the two boxes that are left have to add together to make 11x. So I'm going to go ahead and split that 11x into two boxes, and the X puzzle tells me how that 11x gets split up. It gets split up into 9x and 2x, because 9 plus 2 makes 11. And now I'm going to use my multiplication skills to actually figure out what goes on the outside of my boxes. So I know this is x and this is x. X times 9 is going to give me 9x. 2 times x is going to give me 2x, and 9 times 2 does give me 18. So my factors are x plus 2 times x plus 9 equals 0, because I can rewrite x squared plus 11x plus 18 as a product of x plus 2 and x plus 9. And now it says set each linear factor equal to 0. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the first parentheses, x plus 2, and put it equal to 0, because if you're multiplying and your answer is 0, remember one of these two parentheses then has to have a value of 0. This whole parentheses could be 0. So if this first parentheses really is 0, what does x have to be to make that parentheses change to a 0? Well, x plus 2 equals 0. What does x have to equal so that when you add 2, you get 0? And the answer is x could be a negative 2. That would make negative 2 plus 2, that would make that whole parentheses 0, and 0 times anything is always going to be 0. But what if this parentheses is the one that's really equal to 0? So let's see what this x value has to be when we say x plus 9 equals 0. And the value of x, when I add 9 that equals 0, x has to have a value of negative 9. So my roots, my solutions, my zeros are negative 9 and negative 2. My parabola is going to cross the x-axis at negative 9 and negative 2. All right, for completing the square, we're going to look at this really quick. It's very much like square root symbol. So what we have to do, though, is we have to create a situation where we are getting parentheses squared equals a number so that we can take the square root. So what I'm going to do here is when I take x squared, think of this as like your box. I split 12x evenly, so I have 6 and 6 here. But when I multiply 6 times 6, I don't get 18. So this C coefficient is not going to work for me on complete the square. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move it to the other side. So I'm going to have x squared plus 12x plus something has to equal a negative 18. And I've got a negative 18 because I subtracted 18 from both sides. And I've got to fill this in by completing the square. So we've got 6x and 6x. That's what those lines represent. And 6 plus 6 makes 12x. Well, now I got to figure out what's here. And if it helps you, I'm going to put these on the outside. So I've got x plus 6 plus 6, because that's going to make, let me write it on here. This would be 6x and this would be 6x. Well, what does 6 times 6 make? That makes 36. So that's what's going to go here, 36. And if you notice, look what's on the outside. That becomes x plus 6 times x plus 6, which I can then write as x plus 6 squared. Okay? So now I'm going to turn this into x plus 6 squared equals a negative 18. But when we added 36 to this side, we've got to add 36 to this side as well. So I'm going to turn on my calculator and I'm going to say, okay, if I had a negative 18 because I moved the 18 over and then I added 36 to complete the square, I'm really now going to be left with 18. So I've got x plus 6 squared equals 18. And now if you look, you have a 1 in front of the parentheses, and when you have a 1 in front of something squared, you are ready to take the square root of both sides. And now, here's what I'm going to do. Remember that your power of 2, your parentheses, and your square root, they all cancel out, and you are left with x plus 6 equals, I know that 18 is not a perfect square number, so I'm going to have to birthday cake, which I'm going to do down here. I know 18 is divisible by 2, which gives me 9. 9 is divisible by 3, and 3 is divisible by itself, which is going to give me the 1 on top of my birthday cake that I need to know that I am finished. I do not have to do anything else, and I'm going to focus on these here. And because I'm taking the square root, I need to make a group of 2, so I'm actually going to move out those 3's. So I'm going to have 3 square root 2. And remember, I have to have 2 answers, positive and negative. So now I'm going to split, because what if x plus 6 is equal to the negative 3 square root 2 answer? What does x have to be? Well, I got to subtract 6 from both sides. So I'm going to get x equals negative 3 square root 2, and then I'm going to subtract 6. I cannot say negative 3 minus 6 and get negative 9. I have to leave them separate terms. So there's one answer. Then I would have x plus 6 is equal to the positive 3 square root 2 answer. And now I've got to move the 6 to the other side by subtracting. So I'm going to get x equals 3 square root 2 minus 6. So those are my 2 answers. My x, or my parabola, is crossing the x-axis at 3 square root 2 minus 6 and negative 3 square root 2 minus 6.